Welcome back, team, to the Building Lifelong Athletes podcast. Thanks so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it. If we haven't had the chance to meet yet, my name is Jordan Rennicke. I'm a dual board certified physician in family and sports medicine. And the goal of this podcast is to keep you active and healthy for life through actionable evidence-informed education. Today, we're talking all about methylene blue. It's a topic that's been out there, so let's dive in. So this is an interesting one. So it's a unique conversion point, right? So this is something that has been around for years and years and years, right? This is going back 100 plus years. A compound initially made in the textile and dye industry is what it came down to. But it turns out this was the first ever fully synthetic therapeutic agent, meaning this was the first ever product that was completely made in the lab and then used on patients. So that's what it is. And it's interesting because it's understanding is where it comes from and how it's paradoxical and how it kind of we can use it. And so we'll kind of go through the history of it and how it was made into the uses of it. Today, modern use cases for it, the actually like FDA-approved uses for it, and then actually like what people are talking about on the internet. Because we're talking about it today, because a lot of people on the biohacking community or in social media are talking about this a lot. So that's why I want to dive into it. So first, let's go back to its roots. So it was first synthesized in 1876 by a German chemist, and he's at a chemical company. So essentially, the official chemical name is methylthioneum chloride. So that is a long name, but we're going to go methylene blue is what we're going to say today. But it holds a special distinction, right? It was, as I mentioned before, the very first fully synthetic drug to be used in medicine. And so there also is a caveat as well. So methylene blue is distinct and often confused with other dyes like methyl blue or new methylene blue, which apparently are very different. So methylene blue is different from those things. Initially, this was made, it was purely industrial, right? So this company was awarded a patent for this for dyeing things, is what it kind of came down to. It was a very blue thing. You've ever seen a picture of it. It's a very, very blue, like a vibrant blue. Its widespread uses were because of the blue color. So it was used in textiles, wool, silk, cotton, as well as paper. So that's like what's the main thing it was used for. So essentially this thing that we're talking about today was used as a dye. But it's kind of interesting because there was a leap, right, from this industrial dye to a therapeutic agent. How did that happen? Well, it was actually like kind of cool story. So it was definitely a result of a deliberate scientific hypothesis from a German physician and Nobel laureate, actually Paul Ehrlich is his name. And he had a guiding principle. He believed drugs and dyes work similar fashion because they selectively bind to things. So he kind of had a core theory. If a dye could preferentially stain a pathogen, it might also be able to selectively harm or kill it without affecting the host tissues, right? So in medicine, in pathology specifically, a lot of times you use stains to then stain certain things on the microscope you're looking for. So the slide you're looking at a certain membrane or organelle or a pathogen, something like that. It goes to them. And so he's saying, hey, if it can do that, can we actually go in the body and attack something specifically? So it's kind of interesting. What happened was late in the 19th century, that physician observed that methylene blue selectively stained the malaria parasite Plasmodium within human blood samples. So it was able to stain Plasmodium. And then this observation was a catalyst for same kind of magic bullet concept, a chemical designed to seek and destroy a specific pathogen. He's saying, hey, why does it go just to this Plasmodium? Can I use it in other ways as well? And so that's kind of where it came from. And then putting his theory to test in 1891, Ehrlich and his colleagues administered methylene blue to 2 patients suffering from malaria and reportedly successfully cured them. Obviously, this is going a long time back and there's lots of other confounding factors, but that's kind of where this started. And this was hailed as kind of a big event because this is the first time ever in history a fully synthetic lab-created chemical was used to treat an infectious disease in humans. And so this event kind of gave birth to the field of what we know now in terms of current pharmacologics, in terms of creating entirely synthetic things, also time a lot of chemotherapies as well. So it kind of started saying, hey, this is a origin story of that. I thought it was kind of interesting to at least understand that backstory, where it came from. Not that it's like the most important thing, but this is a podcast. It's deep dive. It's what we do. But yeah, that's interesting. So now though, we know where it came from. Let's talk about like how it might actually work. So the mechanism of it and how it actually something called pleiotropic. Pleiotropic meaning many effects. So there's multiple different things that's going on. It can have different things. So it isn't just a single target drug, right? It's pleiotropic, meaning it works through multiple distinct mechanisms potentially. Its pharmacologic kind of properties, it's kind of like a chameleon. It kind of, depending on the context, it can change. So whether it's the cell type or the concentration, it can act as different things. So specifically, it can act as a mitochondrial enhancer, a neuromodulator, a vasopressor, or potentially an antidote as well. So there's kind of multiple things that it can do. The key to understanding its varied effects, though, is the concept of hormesis or hormetic response curve. So meaning there's a biphasic response curve, meaning if you go low concentration, they're typically considered therapeutic and bioenergetic, working from the mitochondria. Whereas when they're higher concentrations, they can become inhibitory or even toxic potentially, and could potentially produce the complete opposite effect of the low doses. So when we talk about this hormetic or biphasic response curve, meaning, hey, at one dose, a lower dose, we have a different outcome than if we do at a higher dose. That's essentially what we're looking for. So let's dive into these mechanisms one by one. The first mechanism is going through talking about the mitochondria and electron transport chain. So this is kind of the big one that everyone talks about, and the reason there's so much fuss about this today in social media for neurodegenerative diseases, nootropics, anti-aging, all that stuff. So here's the problem. In states of metabolic stress. So the problem meaning when you are metabolically stressed or aging or have disease, your mitochondria can have inefficiencies in getting energy. So essentially, specifically the electron transport chain, it's essentially the production line of energy. It can get bogged down, meaning that, hey, they don't function as well. One of the hallmarks of aging is that we don't aren't as efficient as we usually were or when we were younger with our electron transport chain, with our mitochondria in general. And so the idea is, hey, in some sort of issue, if the mitochondria is not functioning at full capacity, that can be an issue, and can methylene blue work in that capacity? And so there are multiple complexes of the electron transport chain. We're not going to go through this. This is like a biochemistry class, and I'm not here to do that. Nobody wants to hear biochemistry, but there are multiple complexes in that are associated 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 that kind of move down along the line, transferring electrons to then produce electricity and energy is what we're going for. So I mean, it's all electricity, right? It's just electrons, but energy is specifically what I was trying to say. And there are multiple common points of failures. Usually complexes 1 and 3 are the big ones. And a lot of times these, electron flow can potentially stall out. And then this can have major consequences, meaning impaired ATP production, as I talked about, less energy, and potentially a leak of electrons that creates different things called reactive oxygen species. So we have these electrons that are charged and they escape out. They can create these reactive oxygen species, which drive oxidative stress, which is not good. So these are different reactive oxygen molecules that lead to bad things, typically bad outcomes. And so how does methylene blue fit into this? Well, at lower doses, it acts as a electron cycler, or essentially an alternate electron carrier. It can take on these electrons and kind of bypass the electron transport chain and continue to move the energy through the cell. So it's almost like creating a bypass or detour around a potential traffic jam in the electron transport chain. And, step by step, what we can go through this and talks about accepting electrons directly from NAD, then completely bypassing it or whatever. It's not really that important. Just know that it can shuttle electrons back and forth. It can kind of skip there and kind of go as well. One thing that is worth mentioning, though, is that when the oxidized methylene blue gets converted to its reduced colorless form, that is one of the properties as well. So it can be a blue when it's oxidized, and then when it's reduced down, it can be kind of this clear thing called leucomethylene blue. And that's interesting to mention. And that leucomethylene blue diffuses across the mitochondria and donates these electrons. So essentially that can happen. And so the big thing is it can kind of go in between these two different forms, which is kind of interesting, the reduced and oxidized form, but it can kind of shuttle back and forth. And yeah, it works on dropping electrons off and doing that stuff and repeating the cycle and kind of helping with the mitochondria. So that's a way too simplified version of it. And I didn't feel like bogging down the details because, quite honestly, I wasn't super interested in learning all the biochemistry again. Obviously, if you've gone through biochemistry, you're familiar with that stuff, but that's the general idea of what's going on. And so the idea is, hopefully, with this mechanism, what's happening? Well, one, we're producing more energy. Hopefully it rescues cellular energy metabolism and restores the process of ATP synthesis to like its full capacity. That's good. Hopefully we also have 2, less damage, meaning by creating an alternate pathway, hopefully we're preventing those electron jams, essentially traffic jams, and reduces the amount of reactive oxygen species and oxidative stress we have. And then the third is hopefully that we have kind of restart in the mitochondria as well, that some evidence may suggest that by improving the overall mitochondrial health, methylene blue may promote mitochondrial biogenesis, meaning actually the creation of more mitochondria. So that can be very helpful as well. And so this, triad of effects, enhancing ATP, reducing oxidative stress, and promoting mitochondrial renewal. This is hopefully this is the reason why people say, hey, this is why it may work so well for so many different things. Like it's this mechanism, right? So that's the first one. Okay, and so that was mechanism 1, and now moving on to mechanism 2. So completely separate from the mitochondrial effects, methylene blue can act as a neuromodulator as well, and it can be a powerful, reversible, selective inhibitor of an enzyme called monoamine oxidase A, so MAO-A. If you prescribe medications, you've probably seen these monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So what do these MAO inhibitors do, or the enzymes? Well, they're responsible for breaking down key monoamine neurotransmitters. And these monoamine transmitters, we'll talk about them. The big ones here, there's MAO-A and MAO-B. MAO-B, not really that important for what we're looking at here. It breaks down, phenylethylamine, but monoamine oxidase A breaks down serotonin, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and melatonin. So big ones. And also both enzymes can metabolize dopamine and tyramine as well. So, but the big thing is it can break down a lot of those things. And we talk about MAO-A inhibitor breaks down serotonin, norepinephrine, epinephrine, melatonin. That's pretty important stuff there. And so it is a very potent inhibitor of MAO-A. It does also have a little bit of B as well, but it's more selective to A. So that's just something to mention as well. And so it means that at clinically relevant doses, it acts more as a selective MAO-A inhibitor. And so what happens when this happens? Well, by blocking MAO-A, methylene blue prevents the degradation of serotonin and norepinephrine, right? And this leads to an increased concentration and availability of these crucial neurotransmitters, which are heavily involved in regulating things like mood, anxiety, cognition, right? You think about SSRIs, we're trying to have more of these good chemicals. I think like the anti-anxiety or depression like pills, a lot of times what they're doing is they're trying to create more of these things, right? So we're trying to get more serotonin, more norepinephrine. That's what we're going for. And this mechanism is the mechanism behind its antidepressant and anti-anxiolytic effects, so anti-anxiety effects as well. And you can see it. It's done previously. They've done bipolar trials using this as well. So that's what it was. But this is a strong MAO inhibitor, right? And so it is, but it also, this is the source of probably the most dangerous interaction of the medication, the risk of life-threatening, something called serotonin syndrome, which we'll talk more about when you combine multiple medications, right? So if you are on a SSRI and then you take methylene blue, you could potentially precipitate this serotonin syndrome. So something to think about. All right, and so that was our second mechanism. Now let's talk about our third mechanism, acting as a vasopressor. So in critical care medicine, methylene blue is known as a vasopressor, an agent that increases your blood pressure, right? So this comes from, it kind of inhibits the nitric oxide pathway. So in normal physiology, nitric oxide is the body's primary signal for vasodilation and relaxing those blood vessels. But in pathologic states, things like septic shock, this can lead to way too much NO and leading to way too much vasodilation. When we have way too much vasodilation, there's a dramatic drop in blood pressure. It can lead to lots of issues and doesn't respond necessarily to pressors. So pressors are like the medications you give to contract those blood vessels back down to increase that blood pressure. So you usually give those when someone's sick and their blood pressure is too low or whatnot. And how methylene blue works though is they give this, everything else isn't working essentially. It's definitely not a first line. Like you're flipping through, you're gonna be like, give me methylene blue. No, that's not gonna be the case, but it may be helpful in that situation. What typically happens, how does it work? Well, it directly inhibits the enzymes that produce nitric oxide in the first place. And more importantly, it also inhibits an enzyme SCG that nitric oxide talks to, essentially preventing any nitric oxide that is produced from having its effects. So essentially, it's like shutting down the effects of nitric oxide. That's what it does. And so it shuts down this whole pathologic vasodilation, causing vasoconstriction and leading to an increase in blood pressure. That's the idea behind it. And a lot of times it's used for refractory septic shock. Like I mentioned, this is not a first line, but it can be used there as well. Now moving on to mechanism 4, can act as a redox agent, which is essentially a reducing agent like we talked about with administering electrons and whatnot. So, and this is the mechanism behind methylene blue's only FDA-approved indication, treating acquired methemoglobinemia. And you're like, that's a big word. What is that? Well, methemoglobinemia, this is a life-threatening condition where the iron in your hemoglobin is the wrong state, meaning normally the iron is iron 2+. But in this situation, for whatever reason, it is iron 3+. And this results in a molecule or methemoglobin, which is incapable of transporting oxygen, leading to severe tissue hypoxia and potentially could have death. So how does methylene blue fix that? Well, it acts as a cofactor to dramatically speed up the body's natural but very slow pathway for fixing this problem. So typically, this is once again biochemistry boring. Inside the red blood cells, we have an enzyme in something called the pentose phosphate pathway that produces NADPH. And then this NADPH, another enzyme, reduces the methylene blue. Remember from methylene blue to leukomethylene blue, so the kind of neutral one. And then that leukomethylene blue is a potent reducing agent and then donates an electron directly to methemoglobin, converting it back to its state, the oxygen carrying state of iron 2+. So essentially, methylene blue helps donate an electron to go from iron 3+ to iron 2+, making it functional again and making you not die of hypoxia. That's what is going on. And yeah, it's very efficient, reduces the half-life of methemoglobin from hours to just minutes. And so that's kind of what happens, kind of assists in there. But you have to be careful if you go way too high of a dose, like greater than 7 milligrams per kilogram, it can overwhelm the system and start acting as an oxidizing agent, making the condition potentially even worse. So we got to give the right dosing there. We also have to consider that we have to think about an enzyme called G6PD. So the entire mechanism is absolutely dependent on NADPH from the pentose phosphate pathway in the red blood cells we talked about, but a key enzyme for that is G6PD. And in patients with something called G6PD deficiency, there isn't enough NADPH to activate methylene blue into leukomethylene blue, so the drug is completely ineffective. And so worse, this unmetabolized, oxidized methylene blue puts on massive oxidative stress in an already fragile red blood cells and could potentially cause even worse or make it worse or cause hemolysis, which is even worse as well. So lots of things could happen. So long story short, this is another thing where you have to know before you're giving this if someone has G6PD deficiency. So it's a screen for in the military. A lot of times you have to understand that and do it. But this is an indication where like if you had this, like straight contraindication, would not do it. And so we've talked about kind of the mechanisms, a lot of nerdy stuff. And you're like, man, this is more than I signed up for. But hey, we're going to keep going. But what are the clinical applications, right? So once again, there's kind of two roles we're thinking about, the rescue agent versus the remodeling agent. So when looking at the evidence, a clear pattern emerges, right? So methylene blue is at its best as a rescue agent in acute life-threatening physiologic crises, right? Methemoglobinemia, that's like the best thing we know it for. Where in contrast, its utility as a long-term remodeling agent, meaning kind of the working on the slow chronic diseases, it's far less certain. We don't necessarily know how it does that or if it does any real benefits, but that's what everyone's talking about on the internet, right? So it's important to understand what the data actually shows versus like what people are saying online. So we'll kind of go through that. Once again, the sole FDA-approved application is for that methemoglobinemia. And this is like the one and only official job approved by the United States FDA treating methemoglobinemia in both adults and children. It's great that it's approved for that because then we say, hey, cool, it's safe. And when we give it in the appropriate doses, that's great. And we love that. And so a lot of times we're trying to figure out today, are there other ways we can use this? Not necessarily through just at this dosing, just for methemoglobinemia, but how can we use it in other ways? Off label is kind of what we say. But yeah, overall, that's kind of the first thing, right? It's the first line life-saving antidote for that and used for, pretty standard of care there. So it can be helpful, but most people aren't doing that. And that's not necessarily the whole thing. This is usually a higher dose intravenously as well, worth mentioning. And now I want to mention the off-label rescue uses, right? So we talk about potential refractory shock, as I mentioned, can be a rescue agent for having refractory shock, not responding to that. Can be helpful. Also can be used for something called vasoplegic syndrome, a severe form of shock with profound low blood pressure that's refractory to, once again, conventional vasopressors. So most people listening to this, if you're in shock, someone else is taking care of you. You're not doing that. So we'll keep moving on as well. So I'm not too worried about those big things. But also of note, it has been used in the past for cyanide poisoning, which I thought was interesting. We've kind of had, it's no longer recommended as first line as we have different things that we can do, but it's used for that. Also, it can be used as a dye in medical things, so a surgical diagnostic dye. So a lot of times what happens is it can be used in sentinel lymph node biopsy, where essentially you can inject them near a tumor in breast cancer or melanoma surgeries, and it stains the first draining lymph node blue, allowing the surgeon to easily identify and remove them. So just remove the things we need to do. Can also be used for urologic and GI procedures, meaning, hey, it stains things, saying, hey, take these out. That's going to be helpful as well. So those are some indications as well. But now I want to move on to kind of like the next frontier, why people are talking about this on social media, right? And so first things first, they said, hey, all these things with the electrons and all these things with mitochondria, can this be helpful for neuro diseases? I mean, like Alzheimer's or dementia, anything like that. And so there's lots of excitement come from preclinical studies showing it could inhibit the aggregation of tau protein, one of the core pathologies of Alzheimer's, right? And there was a large-scale phase 3 trial. They were conducted using a stabilized form of the molecule called LMTM, designed for better oral absorption. And unfortunately, there was a kind of disappointing result. The trials failed their primary endpoints. The LMTM did not show a statistically significant benefit over placebo in the overall study population. And subsequent research actually found an interesting explanation. They're saying, hey, while methylene blue did inhibit the formation of large insoluble tau fibrils, so these tau fibrils are one of the hallmarks of dementia and Alzheimer's, it may also simultaneously stabilize small soluble tau oligomers. I mean, like the growing body of evidence supports that these big ones aren't actually a big problem. It's more the smaller ones that are the most neurotoxic. So they might have said, hey, actually, it inhibits these big ones, which we don't necessarily need to do. We need to work on these smaller ones. And so it may not have been effective for that reason. And so the trial may have failed, not because the drug was inactive, but because it was active on the wrong target, potentially shifting the equilibrium towards a more toxic form of the protein. So that's just something to think about. There's also been talks about using it for things like Parkinson's disease and traumatic brain injury, and preclinical studies in animal models have shown methylene blue can protect the vulnerable dopaminergic neurons, likely by improving mitochondrial function. That's can be helpful. It's also the LMTM form was shown to reduce the aggregation of alpha-synuclein, which is another key pathologic protein in Parkinson's disease, in a mouse model. Once again, mouse models. And then also for traumatic brain injury, animal models, people have been treated, or these animals have been treated with methylene blue and been shown to reduce neuronal apoptosis, improve blood-brain barrier integrity, and lead to better cognitive motor outcomes. And these benefits are directly attributed to its ability to restore mitochondrial respiration and reduce oxidative stress. But once again, this is just mouse, so we're not necessarily how to extrapolate that to humans. Other applications in psychiatry actually has been tried to use for bipolar disorder, and this is where the most prominent evidence probably is for psychiatry. In a randomized, double-blind, controlled crossover study, found that methylene blue used as an add-on therapy significantly improved residual symptoms of depression and anxiety in patients with bipolar disorder. It was not a big study, but it was important because also it's important to mention that this occurred without an increased risk of increasing mania, right? So when we have a patient, we're giving a medication, if they have bipolar and you give them like a traditional SSRI or something like that, you worry about flipping into mania, which is this kind of hyperactive state of everything. This didn't seem to do that. There's also been some studies for depression. Early small studies from several decades ago suggested that maybe methylene blue had a potent antidepressant effect in patients with severe depressive illness. And the evidence base for this is not very as robust as for bipolar disorder, but it also has been tried for as antidepressant, anti-anxiolytic as well. And it probably warrants further investigation, but is kind of looking at. Also for malaria has been used. We talked about Plasmodium back in the day, used to treat those people for malaria. It has been used previously, although a lot of times we have other anti-malarials, although there's increased resistance going on in the world in those. So they're thinking about going, kind of looking for other options as well. But it's definitely not their first line anymore, but it's something that has been used and been worthwhile. Other properties, they talk about potentially having antiviral properties or antibacterial properties. They say it exhibits broad spectrum antiviral activity in vitro against a range of different viruses like Zika, dengue, HIV, and hepatitis C, which is kind of interesting, which is why they mentioned that. And then also it's also been known to have antibacterial properties and was historically used for urinary tract infections. And yeah, so it's not a first line for any of those things, but that's kind of where we've been and things we've tried. And I do want to move into next, though, the modern phenomena, right? So methylene blue as a biohack. That's the big thing everyone talks about. Do we need to take it? And a recent phenomenon has been going on. It's been moved beyond the hospital and the lab to become a major trend online, and the wellness influencers, the biohacking, anti-aging community saying, you need to take this. And this trend has been fueled by social media influencers and podcasters. Dang it. Just not me, but no, it is. You look online and you look on YouTube and there's just everywhere people are talking about it. And so that's why I was like, whoa, what the heck is this thing? But it's being promoted as a powerful nootropic, right? So, or a smart drug for enhancing memory, focus, and mental clarity, as well as a revolutionary anti-aging supplement. And it's important to remember upfront that these claims represent a significant extrapolation from the available human evidence, creating a major disconnect between preclinical promise and proven clinical benefit, right? So let's break down the narrative here, right? So the central claim made by these biohackers and its proponents is that low doses, so low oral doses, can provide a tangible cognitive boost and slow the biological aging processes. And it's compelling, right? So it's a compelling narrative because it's built upon scientifically valid foundation, right? Methylene blue has a well-documented ability to enhance mitochondrial respiration, potentially increase ATP, and reduce oxidative stress. And so the logic presented is definitely seductive, right? Since the brain is an extremely energy-intensive organ, and mitochondrial decline is a hallmark of aging, a substance that improves mitochondrial efficiency should, in theory, improve brain function and promote longevity, right? That's what it is. But here's the big omission, right? This marketing narrative focuses on exclusively the mitochondrial effects, which leads to the complete omission of anything else it may be doing, and its equally potent MAO inhibiting effects as well. And so this selective presentation of information creates a public health risk, saying like, hey, like just take it. It's fine. It's at a low dose, but like not mentioning that if you combine these things with a traditional medication like SSRI, SNRI, it could lead to this kind of serotonergic syndrome, so serotonin syndrome, which is not good. So life-threatening, could be bad, but people are saying, hey, we've seen these studies, these little studies. If you take a low dose, it can do X, Y, and Z, so therefore we'll do that. That's a huge leap to make. And once again, I'm not the person who's going to be the most cutting edge. And I wouldn't say even cutting edge. Like this isn't cutting edge. This is just like extrapolation, like literally just like saying, oh, it could do that. Cutting edge is like, hey, we have good data that like this could do that. We've tried these things. It's had a good response from here and there and everywhere along the cycle. And then like, this is the newest thing that's very evidence-based, whereas this is just like, oh, like it could do this, therefore it does. And it's like, that's a whole lot. And looking at the evidence, what is the actual evidence here? It's kind of interesting. If we critically look at the literature, it reveals that the vast majority of evidence supporting these nootropics and anti-aging claims is derived from preclinical studies and cell cultures and animal models, the vast majority of them. These studies have shown that methylene blue can improve learning and memory in rodents, protect neurons from various insults, and delay cellular senescence in cultured human skin cells. So that's important. However, the actual clinical data in healthy human subjects is extremely limited and preliminary. The most frequently cited human evidence comes from a small number of functional MRI studies. So essentially functional MRI looks like where does your brain light up? These studies report that a single acute low dose of oral methylene blue can increase activity in brain regions associated with short-term memory and sustained attention during the performance of specific cognitive tasks. And so this increased brain activity was associated with a modest, statistically significant improvement in approximately 7% of memory retrieval performance compared to placebo. And so that's usually what they're weighing on, saying, hey, in these fMRI studies, we see like an increased, activation in the brain. Like that's a big leap to say, hey, this is going to do that. But that's once again where it comes from. And so this is it's imperative to recognize that there's limitations, right? There's limitation to these findings. They demonstrate a short-term neurobiological effect after a single dose. They don't provide any evidence for the safety or efficacy in chronic long-term use at all. So that's the thing. You see the study, you can only extrapolate from a study what was studied, right? So this short-term thing, you can't say then, okay, well, it must do this long-term. It may do that long-term, it may do that, but you can't say that. And that's like where a lot of the biohackers go and say it does that. The leap from observing acute changes in blood flow on fMRI scan to broad claims of sustained cognitive enhancement and longevity is a classic example of the mechanism as proof fallacy, meaning like, hey, mechanisms there. We have some maybe studies that show it, so therefore it must be true. That's not necessarily. A plausible biologic mechanism is necessary for starting point of, is a necessary starting point for starting research and understanding therapeutic interventions. Absolutely. But it's not a substitute for rigorous long-term studies that actually prove the clinical benefit. So to date, no such trials have been done for methylene blue as a nootropic or an aging agent of any sort in healthy humans. So that's to think about. And then once again, I always have to talk about, anytime we're talking about supplements like this or medications, you have to think about the purity problem, right? So there's a big unregulated market. So there's a actual like pharmaceutical grade of this, right? So you can prescribe methylene blue. That is something you can do, but much of the product is available online, it's sold as a chemical grade essentially, or for research purposes only. This is similar to like I've done a previous podcast on like PPC 157. You're getting these as research experimental things only, right? So people have also bought this because you can make fish tanks blue. And so you just drop it in there and say they've used that. Wouldn't recommend that. But once again, these non-pharmacological grade formulations are not manufactured to any standards really. Like you don't know what they're being manufactured to and could have contaminations. And they've checked previously other methylene blue compounds have had contaminations with heavy metals, including arsenic, cadmium, and lead. And that's a serious risk. And so always be safe of what we're doing, right? So that's what we're thinking about. And then moving on to a safe and effective use of this, like how are we going to use this effectively if we want to? Like, first of all, like you probably shouldn't be doing that. That's like a spoiler alert, but we'll kind of walk through it. The safe and effective use of methylene blue demands a big understanding of the adverse profiles that it could have, its contraindications and significant drug interactions, and its dose-dependent pharmacology, right? So safety isn't as simple as yes or no. It's, requires a careful multifactorial risk stratification based on genetics like your G6PD status, other medications, the intended dose, route of administration, all those things. And failure to consider those could convert a potentially life-saving drug into a dangerous one. So you think about like, hey, I'm just taking this thing. Someone told me to. You didn't know that you had G6PD deficiency and you were also on the SSRI. You didn't know that, but the biohacker didn't mention that. Like those are legitimate like health things that I worry about. And this is my world, right? As a physician, like I see bad things all the time. So I see complications, I see bad things. So I'm always like worried about this. Like the vast majority of people clearly online who've taken this have not had this. The vast majority of people don't have G6PD deficiency, but it's just something to think about, right? So I just always like, my job is to not harm someone and not have anyone get harmed by the advice that I'm giving them. So that's why I always harp on that. So just something to think about. But what are side effects from this, right? If people are taking this, what are side effects? So the most common and expected side effect is blue-green discoloration of the urine, feces, and sometimes skin and saliva, sometimes like eyes, the white of the eyes. It's harmless, predictable, and it's not really bad, but it could be alarming if you're not used to it, right? All of a sudden you wake up one day, you're being blue, you're like, what's going on? Other reported effects include nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, headache, dizziness, potentially increased sweating as well. And there are some serious adverse effects as well, right? So cardiovascular can induce hypertension, which is high blood pressure, tachycardia, and chest pain. So as you mentioned before, it's a vasoconstrictor for in the septic shock setting. That's usually a much higher dose, but it can do that. Can also lead to potentially confusion, agitation from a neurologic perspective. And there is a risk for drug-induced hemolytic anemia, which is the destruction of red blood cells, which can happen when you take this as well. So all these things are very real and think about. And as I mentioned, it does have a narrow therapeutic index, meaning the line between therapeutic and toxic is not that big. Doses exceeding 7 milligrams per kilogram are associated with significant toxicity and can induce the very condition it's meant to. So that's like when we're treating high dose, it can make a methemoglobinemia worse. And so that's a big one. Also, as I mentioned before, severe hemolysis, a major risk factor at high doses. There's no real antidote for this as well. So it would be completely supportive if you did do too much. And so most of these doses, people are talking much less than that. Most people are talking like maybe, 1 milligram per kilogram. So a lot lower dose, smaller dose. But once again, we don't necessarily know what that is. And so also have to be mentioned, once again, in terms of side effects, G6PD, administration of methylene blue in patients with G6PD is strictly contraindicated. We do not want to exacerbate things, right? We're going to leave it. Yeah, it's going to be worse. It potentially could lead to lots of issues and triggering life-threatening hemolysis, all those things. So therefore, if you're going to take this, like if you learn one thing, like know your G6PD status. If you're really like hell-bent on taking this, like then do that. That's the thing. Also, it's contraindicated in pregnancy and lactation, right? So it's actually a category X for pregnancy. Category X is like the worst category we can have. It is based on reports of fetal harm, including neonatal intestinal atresia and fetal death following intraamniotic injections of the dye. So category X means like do not take it, do not do it. It could have serious harm to your baby. For lactation, we just don't have any like real like data from it. Nobody ever signs. That's the thing in pregnancy. Nobody ever signs up like, yeah, like, I'll volunteer, do a test on me and my baby. Like that's not happening. So we just say probably hold off on that. The other thing I mentioned for serotonin syndrome, very, very important. This is probably the biggest clinical safety concern out there. The risk arises from its potent MAO activity, like I mentioned, combining with other medications like SSRIs, SNRIs. And so the risk is so significant that the FDA has issued a box warning for all methylene blue products, advising against using it with other serotonergic agents. And so this is really important, right? Because we have like anywhere from like 10 to 15% of the entire population are on either SSRI or SNRI. So a big percent of the population, probably a big amount of people who are watching videos about methylene blue, because these people are typically high wired, high anxiety, a little bit, like have a little bit of health anxiety, and they're trying to optimize everything. And so dabbling in between those two things could be an issue. And so what to look for though? So there's kind of a triad for the serotonin syndrome, a combination of autonomic hyperactivity, things like sweating, fever, fast heart rate, neuromuscular abnormalities, meaning tremor, clonus, hyperreflexia, rigidity. So tremors kind of shaking. Clonus is we're just having like rigidity as well. You kind of consistently view it. Clonus, I think about when you're checking like reflexes, is someone just continue, like you try to get them in position, they kind of continue to pump and oscillate back and forth. It can also have hyperreflexia, rigidity, and then also alter mental status, agitation, confusion, delirium, all that stuff. And in a non-emergency setting, all medications, like if you're going to do this, stop taking your other medications, but you should probably taper those down. So once again, don't take this without like talking with someone first. Don't just like start doing this, but usually you taper it down, right? Typically you stop them and wait about 2 weeks for most SSRIs and SNRIs to get out of the system. If you're on the medication called Prozac or fluoxetine, it might require like 5 weeks for it to get out because it's a very long acting metabolite, but you're going to stop these medications for a while before you start methylene blue. And so I do want to talk about dosing a little bit there. And as I mentioned before, the appropriate dosing for this is dependent on lots of clinical indications. Depending on what you use it for. But doses for acute IV rescue are usually like 1 to 2 milligram per kilogram IV. It's a magnitude higher than those invested for chronic oral use, which is like 0.5 to 1 milligrams per kilogram potentially. And a notable challenge in studying this, it's very difficult in bridging these clinical trials is how do you do a controlled trial, right? So a characteristic blue urine makes it obvious for who's taking it versus who's not taking it. So it's very hard to be like, oh, like if you're blue, like I'm clearly taking something's happening. I guess you could try to make it blue somehow with some other, it'd be challenging. So that's a really big thing, is like getting good data is really challenging, because how do you make it randomized? So the final mandate here is, I think the big point I want to take home is we don't really know what this does for like all the things that people are saying it does, right? So like, oh, it's better for your cognition and memory and Alzheimer's and this and that. It may have an effect on those things, but like we just have no real data to speak on that. And so mechanistically, it's like most things with the biohackers, they take a little grain of truth and then extrapolate and run with it. And they change so many things as well that they don't know what they're changing. They try 7 different things and then something got better. Well, they don't know if it's this one thing so it's just not a very good control study. But if you are going to do this, if you're saying, hey, I need to do this, well, then I would recommend highly trying to get a pharmaceutical grade of this, just because we know what's actually in there. And the unregulated products can have contaminations, all those other things. And so it can be very, very helpful. And the methylene blue sold as supplements or research not intended for human consumption and may lead to issues down the line. And so I just, if you're going to do something that's already like, oh, this is a little like, I'm not sure. And then like taking it, getting it for like research or from a fish tank company, that's like taking too many risks that we need. So if we're going to take risks, let's take calculated risks and do it from there. And so, I think it's kind of interesting, but hopefully you found this enjoyable. It started off as this dye, right? And kind of taken on its life of its own. I think it can be helpful. It can be life-saving in some context. But as we're going on here, it's not necessarily, as clear-cut what it does long term. But either way, I think it's worth mentioning and talking about, because we've seen it. And I think, it's just very helpful overall. But the bottom line is that is a potent and valuable pharmacologic agent in certain situations when it's used appropriately, right? So that's the big thing. Its expansion to the broader domains of chronic disease and wellness are probably premature, meaning that we just don't know, right? So that's the big thing. You see people talking about it. I want you to be informed. I don't care what you do. I say that all the time, like not like I don't care, and not like I want you to do well and I want you to succeed. I want you to be healthy, but like you're an adult, you're an autonomous adult. You can do whatever the heck you want. But I just hope that you have at least thought about this, heard all these things, hear about the side effects, serotonin syndrome, G6PD, like understand these things before we take it. Because a lot of times what happens in the online world is people say, try this without giving any caveat of, hey, like maybe you actually shouldn't if you have these certain conditions. And so that's something I just wanted to mention. So at least you have the info. And if you listen to that and you say, Jordan, you're an idiot. I'm going to take it. Great. That's fine. Godspeed. Go. I have no problem with that, but it's just my job to kind of do that. But that's going to be it for today. Thank you so much for stopping by. If you did find this helpful, though, and mean the world if you either share this with a friend, left a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice, or subscribed on YouTube. But I really do appreciate you stopping by and taking your time to listen. That means the world to me. But that's it for today. Now get off your phone, get outside, have a great rest of the day. We'll see you next time.